That's what I said.
Are you sure that it wasn't?
Yeah, I'm not that surprised, but I'm surprised it's driving. That's surprising, so we'll take a look at it.
We're going to get started in a minute. Started since we have to actually clear out of here by 8:30. So I just want to thank everybody who came out today. I know the weather is atrocious, but I really do appreciate everybody coming out here. And we're all here because we share a common goal. And that is that we want to make our voices heard to the powers that be, that we're not going to sit idly by while our children's education suffers. As parents, we have the right to advocate for our children. As taxpayers, we have the right to know how much of our tax money has gone into implementing Common Core and its aligned high-stakes tests. And as a community, we are coming together to educate others about the education reforms being forced upon our school districts by the state and federal government. We're here today to let our elected officials know that Common Core in Park does not serve the best interest of our students, teachers, and schools, and we urge you to watch the presentation and listen to your constituents. Our children are not common. They're unique individuals with unique talents and abilities, and they are capable of incredible things when given the chance to learn and grow at a developmentally appropriate pace, to learn in ways that make sense to them, not in a singular way deemed correct by the creators of Common Core, and with the help and guidance of teachers who are by far the best source of evaluating their academic progress and not standardized tests. I am extremely fortunate to have worked with an incredible group of people on having this presentation here today. So my huge thanks and support goes to Sportica and to Hop to It Preschool for their generous financial contribution to this. So a huge thank goes to Kim Rodman for helping me get all of that put together, so thank you, Kim. To Jacqueline Brown, who is my second half on all of this, who is actually able to put into words what so many of us feel, and has actually taken those words to our Board of Ed and to the New Jersey State Department of Ed. So thank you, Jacqueline. To Danielle and Nick Sorbara for helping us technically get this out to everybody. And to everyone who is going to be watching this at home. We really do appreciate you taking your time to do this. We're just one of many grassroots efforts popping up around the nation, trying to get the word out and educating parents on this, and we are hoping that it continues. I just want to also just take a minute to thank my kids. You're the ones that inspire me to do this every day. So thank you. So I'm not going to take up way too much time. I'm actually going to introduce Dr. Luksik. Thank you so much for coming here and speaking to everybody.
Is it all right if I video? Is it all right if I video?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to do so. I'll trim, so I'm going to stand in front of the wires. Thank you all for coming tonight. I drove in from Johnstown, so I drove in behind the storm, and hopefully tomorrow I'll drive home after the storm. So I really appreciate you taking the time, especially with Christmas. I'll start with the commercial portion of the program because I forget at the end. On the stage over there, you will see papers that look like this. They're free because people say, how do I get in touch with you? How do I get more information? I write a weekly blog. My organization is called Founded on Truth, and the website is on the paper. This is just one of the blogs. You can feel free to take it and then sign up. Nobody ever bothers you. I write once a week because that's how much I have time for, and you can feel free to share the blogs, Facebook them, and do whatever you want. So do take one of these papers on your way out. There's also videos. I'm going to feed you through a fire hose in the next hour or so, and people say, I followed it while you said it, but I went home and couldn't remember it. So I created a series for you. The red ones are called Should Our Children Be Standardized? And what this does is it actually tracks the research behind what happens in classrooms when the government mandates that every child learn the same thing in the same way on the same day with all the high stakes testing. What happens in classrooms to children at both ends of the spectrum. This one also includes the new Advanced Placement U.S. History standards that you may have heard about, where they're teaching United States history without mentioning people like Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, and they teach World War II without mentioning Adolf Hitler, D-Day, or the Holocaust. So it gives you the information on what's happening there. So that's the red one. The green ones are called invalid and unreliable. The testing is high stakes. They tell us that it is valid and reliable. Those words actually mean something. And so what I did was I tracked the definition of those words and then compared it to the tests. The tests do not meet those definitions at any level. They are at best meaningless and at worst discriminatory in how they're administered and how they're scored. So this is the research on the testing. When you're talking to state officials, both representatives, senators, school board officials, this gives you the words to fight back. Because people can say, I don't like the test, but how do you actually argue it? This teaches you, this is what you say and how you say it. I've used many of these words in testimony in front of state legislatures. I used it in Tennessee, in front of the Tennessee House Education Committee. Tennessee pulled out of the PARCC tests and did not give them. So this gives you some of that ammunition. I took two different states. I live in Pennsylvania because I live there, and New York because it's a governing state like New Jersey, tracked their contracts and what happens in the state. So if you want to have a state to compare, you can pick one or the other. Pennsylvania has more of the actual, how the standards were set in the test. New York is the ELA tests and how the being a governing board of PARCC will affect you, which you are also a governing state of PARCC. So these are $10 because I have to pay to make them. So it's basically a break even for me to make them. What you're going to see is available on the screen. I'm prettier, but that's more important. So look at the screen and nod at me. None of the documents that you're going to see are documents that I wrote. You will be looking at contracts that your state signed with the U.S. Department of Education, either to receive money or to get relief from regulations. And the reason that we look at those contracts is the same reason that, for example, when you go to the bank for a loan and the bank says, how much money did you make? And you say $100 and the bank says, that's very nice. Can I see your IRS tax return? Because you might lie to the bank, but you probably didn't lie to the IRS. Similarly, if your Department of Education tells you they're doing X, but they told the United States Department of Education in a document that they used to get money or relief from regulations that they're doing Y, they're doing Y because it's not a crime to lie to you, but it is a crime to lie to the US DOE. So we'll be looking at those documents. We'll also be looking at some of your internal state memos, newspaper articles. Everything that you see on the screen will be an original source, so you can track it. And when, if you avail yourself of the video, the original documents are on the screen. You will not see me, you'll hear me and see the documents. So you can stop the presentation, you can download a document for yourself. So there's a way for you to track what I said. Let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. I come from Pennsylvania. I have been a teacher for more than 35 years at both special ed and elementary ed. I've taught everything from preschool through college in pretty much every educational setting you can imagine. I have written curriculum, evaluated curriculum. I've trained teachers in classroom management and in how to teach subject areas. When the special ed law that governs IEPs was passed, I was one of the regional trainers for the Northeast Quadrant of the state of Pennsylvania on how to implement that law. And for a number of years, I worked for the United States Department of Education, where my job was to review and analyze education reform initiatives, just like this one. So I have a long experience in education at pretty much every level. Most importantly, I'm the mother of 6 children. They are all girls except for 5 of them. It's an IQ joke. And I'm a grandmother now, which is actually better. I should have done that first. It's much better. Now, this has a long history. We're not going to be here all night. So we're going to start in 1989. In 1989, there was an education summit held in Virginia. George Bush, the elder, was president, and the head of the National Governors Association at the time was a man named William Clinton. They came together and broke local control, setting national education goals for the first time. The core of that meeting became the basis for legislation that was signed in 1994 when Mr. Clinton was then president, called Goals 2000. Now, there was a huge rush of opposition to the idea of breaking local control and having the federal government set national education goals and measure achievement against these mandatory bureaucratic standards. So Goals 2000 wound up without any teeth in it. That was changed in 2001 with the passage of No Child Left Behind under President Bush the Jr. So you see Bush the Senior, Clinton, Bush the Jr. Doesn't matter what political party you're in. This is not a party issue, and there are folks on all sides of the political aisles lining up for it and lining up against it. So it kind of crosses every traditional line that folks think has been existing. No Child Left Behind was passed in 2001. It was what was called a reauthorization bill. In 1965, the federal government for the first time began openly and significantly funding education at your local school level. The bill was called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The federal government is not supposed to have a role in education. There's no constitutional role for it at all. So the way that they get around that role is they made money available to the states and said to the states, did you want this? And the state could say yes or no. So if they said yes, they were legally volunteering for the money, which got around the constitutional prohibition. Now, when the federal government makes money available, it's called an authorization bill. They're authorizing funds to be spent. Those bills all have what is called a shelf life. Money is authorized for this much time. At the end of that time, the bill dies, and so does the money. So the federal government either has to reauthorize the bill or the program goes away. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act has been reauthorized multiple times since 1965. The 2001 reauthorization of that bill was called No Child Left Behind. So it was a continuation of a federal funding program that actually started in the 60s. Now, interestingly, No Child Left Behind died in 2007, and the federal government has not reauthorized it. But because neither have they passed a budget at the federal level, but instead done continuing resolutions, they're all behaving as if a dead bill still exists and forcing states to comply with the dead bill because the money is tied to the 2007 budget. All they're doing is continuing to spend based upon the legal underpinnings of the 2007 budget. So since there's not a new budget, they're using the legal standards from 2007, which is how they're getting around the law. Which creates some legal questions that are being raised at a number of levels. But just so you know, that's where we stand at this moment. What did the No Child Left Behind bill say? It said that every state had to set academic content standards and academic achievement standards for every child. What's the difference between a content standard and an achievement standard? An achievement standard says you will comply. If this was medicine, everybody in this room has to have a blood pressure of, fill in a number. That's an achievement standard. A content standards. This is what will be taught. Medicine. Every doctor will give every patient that comes into his office this much insulin. That's content standard. Now, when we move to medicine, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Somehow when it became education, the idea that it was ridiculous got lost. It's equally ridiculous as trying to mandate blood pressure, but that's in fact what they're doing. So content was for the schools, achievement was for the children. This was a mandate from the government to your child. First time that ever happened. It said that it would apply to all public schools and that the standards would be in math, reading, or language arts. Now we call that ELA, English Language Arts, and science. The law said that the standards would be rigorous. Now, when you debate Common Core, you're going to hear the word rigorous a lot because the proponents of Common Core use it all the time. It's a marketing word. In marketing, it's called the law of the seventh mentioning. You need to hear it 7 times before you even know you heard it. Which is why, for example, if I say, we are farmers, you'll all say, bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum. Because when one is in your head, the other's in your head. So the proponents of Common Core always say rigorous, so that every time the standards are mentioned, that word pops in your head. We'll look at the definition for rigorous tonight. The states had to define what they called levels of achievement. Advanced was what you think. Proficient was passing. And then basic would be a C- or a D. You have some knowledge, but you're not really where you need to be. And the way that the states were measured, every state, every year, had to make progress toward having every child meet the proficiency level on the standards. And every year they had to get closer. That's what adequate yearly progress means. When you're involved in this, you keep hearing the letters AYP. It means every year your state had to get closer. And there were benchmarks set up for every state. This year you had to get 10%. Next year you have to get another 3%. I made those numbers up, but you know what I mean. Those were your benchmarks that you had to meet to prove that you were making progress. And the way that it was measured was with the state assessment. So every state had to set up an assessment that would assess reading and math and eventually science. And that would be what they would submit to the federal government to prove that their children were in fact meeting the standards. And No Child Left Behind mandated, and the bottom paragraph is actually from the bill, all of the language is from the bill, that 12 years after the bill was passed, so by the close of the school year that ended last year, 100% of the children had to be testing at proficient in reading, math, and science in the state. Every state had to prove that every single child was passing in those 3 subjects. Well, that created some consternation in the states because that's an impossible standard. But the states were told that they could set the definition of proficient wherever they wanted. It didn't matter what you called proficient. The state could define it however they wanted to define it. So here in New Jersey, this is from your 2013, it's right off of the Department of Education website. If you look at the bottom, your state said that in 2013 in grade 8, 70.5% of the children were proficient and 11.5% were advanced. So you had about 82% of the kids scoring proficient or advanced in grade 8 English according to your state assessment. And in math, if you match the proficient and advanced, you have about 70% of the kids, 69-point-something% of the kids are proficient or advanced at those levels, which parents then were getting pieces of paper saying, congratulations, little Johnny is proficient, and people felt really good about that. Was that real? The United States Department of Education has a test called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It is given in all 50 states. It isn't given to every single child. They kind of sample across the states to get, this is where your state is. The National Assessment actually is recognized as a valid and reliable assessment. So in 2013, the National Assessment was given, this is the grade 8 reading, and if you look, remember we looked at the chart before, your state assessment said about 82% of the kids were proficient or above. When those same 8th graders in the same year took a test on 8th grade reading, which you would think would be the same subject matter, given by the national assessment, only 47% of them passed. Well, either you're reading at the 8th grade level or you're not. So why the big discrepancy? Maybe it got better in math. Remember, your state said about 70% of the kids were proficient. This is the National Assessment 2013 grade 8 math results, 49% passed. Those numbers don't match either. Why? Let me show you. Stand up. Wiggle while you're up. Exercise is good. Okay, this is vocal performance. When you can meet the standard, you can sit down, but you cannot sit down until you meet the standard. Are you ready? Okay, Luciano Pavarotti. Anybody who can sing like Pavarotti, greatest tenor of the 20th century, can sit down. Soloist with the New York Met. Chorus member with the New York Met. Soloist with the Regional Symphony. Chorus member with the Regional Symphony. Soloist with the church choir. Sings in the church choir. Sings in the shower and enjoys it. Can't carry a tune in a bucket. Can't find the bucket. Okay. The goal is, the requirement was, everybody had to be proficient. But I can set the standard wherever I want. Where am I going to set the standard for vocal performance? Where did you all sit down? At Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It. I am a teacher in a classroom. There is no reward whatsoever for me for one child taking one step beyond the standard. But there are huge punishments if every child doesn't meet the standard. Where am I going to spend all my time? At the child that Mr. can't find to carry a tune in a bucket over there. I'm going to ignore, there was a Mr. can't find the bucket, I'm going to ignore the very bottom because I'm going to cut my losses. The ones who can never reach the standard, I'm going to ignore. I'm also going to ignore the top. The child for whom the standard should have been Pavarotti. Why? Because that child walked in the classroom able to sing in the shower and enjoy it. Meaning they'll pass the test. And the only thing that mattered was the test. So that child would already pass the test and will show up as a success. Was education a success for that child or a failure for that child? It was a failure for that child. And in fact, that's what happens. In this system, the goal of education has moved from teaching the child to reaching the standard. Was that a surprise? No, in 1983, back when Reagan was president, he actually ordered a commission to study education in America, and the report of the commission was a document called A Nation at Risk. And in the document, the folks who did the study said, you know, this whole minimum competency thing that's starting to develop is really a bad idea because the minimum will become the maximum, and educational standards for everyone will decline. So this was predicted before it even began. And that's what's happening in New Jersey. You're getting told, oh yes, these kids are doing great. But then when they take a test where the standards have not been manipulated, they don't do so well. And the difference is enormous. And if you look at the chart, you see a line down the middle of the chart. The numbers of the people who passed, they haven't changed very much in the last 5 or 6 years in your state. In fact, New Jersey, when it talked to the federal government in one of its contracts, it said, we have a number of deficiencies. We're 50 out of the 51 states in the size of the achievement gap between low and high income students in 8th grade reading. We only have minimum numbers of children meeting proficiencies, and nearly 90% of the students entering our community colleges require remediation. Well, if you have more than 80% of your 8th graders being proficient, how can they need remediation when they get into a community college? Those statements don't match. Either your community colleges are having a huge issue here, or your proficiency levels are skewed. New Jersey's not alone. This chart comes from the National Center for Education Statistics. That's an arm of the USDOE. The brown bar at the top is the level of achievement that a child would need to attain to get a score called proficient on the NAEP. The dark blue in the middle is the level of achievement that a child would need to have to get a score of basic, you remember C- to D, on the NAEP. And everything below that is a failure. The little red flags are the level of achievement that every single state used to define proficient in that state. Not one state defined proficient at the same level that the national assessment defined proficient. Only 8 states called proficient, New Jersey's not one of them, only 8 states defined proficient at the level of achievement that the national assessment would determine to be basic, C- or D. And fully 42 states defined proficient below basic. The national assessment would have said you failed. And yet, 42 states called that proficient. In other words, the data you're getting from your states is essentially meaningless. Why? You remember, where did you set the standard? At Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It. The states were told, they were mandated with punishments, everybody has to be proficient. But you can set proficient wherever you wanted. We moved that to medicine with our blood pressure and told every doctor in the country, everybody has to have the same blood pressure or you lose your medical license, but you can set the blood pressure number wherever you want. Where would he put it? At 340 over 280. So everybody would meet it. Because that's what we would do. Well, that's what the states did. They were told to do the impossible. And so they skewed the data to make it look like the impossible was happening. Unfortunately, reality reared its ugly head. And by 2010, the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education found that nearly 60% of our college kids needed remediation. They were coming out of schools being told, parents are being told, yes, little Johnny's proficient. Then they get to college and they can't do it. They have to take remedial English and remedial algebra before they can. Now the colleges routinely test. Some of my children are very odd. They're either all art or all math. So some of my children are engineers, and when they started their colleges, they all had to take entrance exams to see if they would be allowed to go into calculus. Most kids didn't make it. Most kids had to take remedial math, which meant they couldn't graduate on time because those courses were not credit bearing. So it made college last longer. And 60% of our kids needed to do that. Well, how can that be if they're all testing proficient at the high school level? This created some consternation. Into the gap steps the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This is a grant that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gave to the James P. Hunt Institute for $2.2 million. It was to promote the development of internationally benchmarked education standards by states that were rigorous. There's that word again. In that year, the entire income of the Hunt Foundation was $2.5 million. So Gates gave them 2.2 of their $2.5 million. Do you think they were open to what Gates had to say? Yes, they certainly were. Very open. As a matter of fact, there's a Washington Post article talking about how Mr. Gates was approached by the architects of Common Core. They asked him to fund it. And he was very open about the fact that he did so. So instead of examining, well, wait, we've had this standards-based education now since at least 2001. If you count goals 2000 since 1994, all of our kids need remediation, achievement is down, maybe we should rethink the process. No, instead we're going to centralize the standards. We're not changing the process. We're just centralizing control of the standards. The Hunt Institute's response to the money was to create a newsletter called Blueprint, this is the first edition, in which they said they were partnering with Achieve, the Alliance for Excellent Education, the Council of Chief State School Officers, and the National Governors Association to explore the potential for a Common Core, here's where the word first surfaces, of rigorous internationally benchmarked standards. And I will tell you the standards were not internationally benchmarked, and the Common Core website has actually removed that from their language. They are partnering closely. The head of the Hunt Institute, James Hunt, is the vice chairman of Achieve. The head of the Hunt Institute, the chairman of Achieve, a man named Michael Cohen, were all part of, remember the first article we looked at, written by Mark Tucker? They were all part of his organization. They've been pushing this since the 1980s. What they did was they created 3 separate ones. So they started moving toward the standards. The Gates Foundation continued to fund. This is the money the Gates Foundation has given the Hunt Institute since that initial grant. And you can see $5 million, several $100,000, another $1.5 million. The $5 million was to rapidly implement the Common Core. So instead of examining and exploring, what you hear is parents saying, wait, where did this come from? Why didn't anybody tell us first? Why wasn't there a conversation? Because the money was all written in a way to say move as quickly as you can, because now it's harder to get out than to talk about it before it gets in. So the strategy from the beginning was to move rapidly, and you can see it right in the grant. The Hunt Institute continued its newsletters, and they said a number of state organizations have expressed support for these standards, and so we're going to be responding to their expression, that they want these and we're going to respond to the need. And then they list all these organizations who are expressing support for the standards. So I looked them all up to see how much money they got from the Gates Foundation. 25 million, 10 million, 11 million, 37 million, 24 million, 11 million, 4 million, 4 million, and 11 million. The exception is the National Association of Secondary School Principals, which previously did receive money from the Gates Foundation, but their bylaws changed, so they don't receive outside money. They're a dues organization now. So the Hunt Institute, which gets money from the Gates Foundation, said all these organizations are asking for the Common Core standards, and all those organizations get money from the Gates Foundation, and then the Hunt Institute is responding using money from the Gates Foundation to their call. It was a marketing circle, and Mr. Gates funded every piece of it. In fact, he's dropped at this point over $300 million into the development and promotion and defense of the Common Core state standards. Well, maybe he knows something we don't know. Nope. This is an interview with Mr. Gates in the Washington Post where he was interviewed, and he said, it would be great if this worked, but we won't know for probably a decade. His children go to a school that does not do Common Core, so it's okay to experiment on your kids. But he has protected his. Remember, we saw the Hunt Institute was partnering with Achieve. Achieve said, we're going to transform this concept from something that's radical into a national agenda of college and career ready. That's one of those things that sounds really good, but doesn't really mean anything. College and career ready. It's kind of funny. One of my children is an opera singer. So career ready for him meant being able to hit a high G and analyze music theory and take direction and present something on the stage that people would want to pay to see. One of my children is in the Navy. He runs one of our nuclear, he's the nuclear guy on one of our fast attack subs. So he's a Navy nuke. Career ready for him meant physics, chemistry, every kind of math you could possibly imagine, electronics, and nuclear engineering. How do I write one standard that's okay for both of them? And they live in my house. That's just one family. And there are only 2 of my 6. There is no such thing as a box that says career ready, because every career has a different definition of ready. So you can't do this. But it sounds pretty, doesn't it? It just doesn't mean anything. Achieve on its website said that they did this at the direction of 48 states. That's a lie. Not one single state legislature passed one piece of legislation authorizing Achieve to write standards that would be mandatory for every child in that state. Not one single state legislature appropriated one single penny to Achieve for the purpose of writing standards that would be mandatory for the children of that state. This was not directed by the states, it was fed to them. The 2 groups that wrote them, the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association, originally didn't want to tell anybody who was writing the standards, but there was a public outcry. So in July of 2009, they issued a press release. You're looking at it on the right, I just made the words bigger on the left, talking about the standards work group. There were 29 people. They were content experts and testing experts from Achieve itself, from the ACT and the College Board. None of them were classroom teachers. None of them were K through 12 teachers. None of them were freshman level college professors. If you would want to know what does it take to succeed at the freshman level in college English, don't you think you would talk to somebody who taught freshman level college English? They did not. In fact, the architect of the Common Core standards is a man named David Coleman. Mr. Coleman actually tried to get a job teaching in the New York public school system. They declined to hire him. So a man who could not get a job teaching in any classroom in America is the architect, driving education in every school in America. The press release went on to say that the work group's deliberations would be confidential. That means secret. We don't have any minutes. We don't know who chose the members of the work group. We don't know why they were chosen. We don't know what each of them did. We don't know what they looked at in selecting the standards, what rubrics they chose, why they chose what they did. To this day, the process of the development of the standards remains a secret. The press release went on to talk about, there was a second group called the feedback group, and when you debate this, what you hear is, no, there's all these teachers who were involved and they hand you lists. They were all on the feedback groups, where there were teachers. The feedback groups could make suggestions, could make comments, but as the press release says, the work group decisions were final. You know, when my kids were little, every night they would ask for a treat before they went to bed. And every night I could say no. I didn't have to give a reason, and my decision was final. The feedback groups were the children, and the work group was the parent in that picture. All the feedback group could do was say, would you please? And the work group could say no. They didn't have to give a reason, and their decision was final. Finally, there were validation committees. There was one. Originally, there were, I believe, 30 folks on it. In the end, only 25 of them signed. The response of these folks was to remove the names of the non-signers to make it look as though it was unanimous, even though it wasn't. Now, 2 of the non-signers have gone public. Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who is an ELA expert, and Dr. James Milgram, who was a Stanford math teacher for 30 years at Stanford University. They've gone public. The other ones have not. They haven't gone public with their concerns for whatever reasons. But there was no minority report issued. Their concerns were not included. The response of this group was to pretend that they did not exist. So if you look at the report of the work group, it appears unanimous, but it wasn't. They erased the dissenters. This is actually the Common Core website. If you look at their website, you will see that the Common Core standards are copyrighted. If they're actually developed by the states, they could not be copyrighted because if it was developed by taxpayer dollars, you own it. These are 2 private trade organizations. They own the copyright. You have to have a license to use them. The license is only granted if you're going to support the standards, and everything that has to say that these 2 groups are the sole owners and developers, and they give you how to write the copyright, unless you're a state. And when a state adopted the standards, it didn't have to tell anybody that it was actually written by and copyrighted by and owned by 2 private trade organizations. But the website is a little more problematic than that. Do you ever bought a car? I'm sure you have, right? You can go to the dealership, probably at this time of year, some of you are, and buy, that brand new, bumper to bumper, 10-year, 100,000-mile warranty car. Maybe you can't afford that. So you're going to the dealership, but you're buying last year's car, the one that the dealer drove for like 20,000 miles of that 100,000, and so you get the gently used, and so you get the rest of the manufacturer's warranty. Well, maybe you can't afford that either. So you go to a dealer and you buy the high-end car, used car at a dealer, and you get the dealer's warranty. But maybe you can't buy that car either. So you buy the oldest, most dilapidated cars. For most of us, that's our first car. My youngest son is a junior in college, and last summer he proudly, for the first time, with mother's help, which of course he never mentions, bought his very first car for $850. It was his very first car. And you know what it said on that sign? It said, as is. In other words, as soon as you sign that piece of paper, even if you can't get the car off the lot, it's your problem. The Common Core website says that the Common Core standards are offered as is, just like the oldest and most dilapidated cars. The website goes on to say that the owners of the standards assume no liability or responsibility for anything that happens to a school or a child because of their use. They don't stand behind their product even as much as Black & Decker stands behind a power saw. When the standards are being written, a number of people attempted to make a difference. This is an article from the Washington Post, written by 2 early childhood experts, in which they talked about how there was no research and that the people writing the pre-K through 3, the K through 3 standards, none of them were early childhood educators or pediatricians or child development specialists. They didn't have any idea what they were doing. When the standards the draft first came out in March of 2010, some of these folks looked at them and were just shocked. They said, it looks like the people who wrote these have no idea how little ones develop. The standards don't provide ongoing research. See, when something's research-based, it goes like this. I put them out and I say, so, would you test this for me, please? Now I'm going to write back to you and I'm going to ask you, did you like it? What was good? What was bad? It's called a beta, that initial test. And I make changes. And then we continue to have a dialogue. Research-based means I actually research. I test them. I see if it works, what was good and bad. Remember, they were offered as is? They were just plunked down. There's no way for anybody to go back to them and say, these aren't really working very well. There's no feedback, which means it is by definition not research-based. While the standards were being written, the folks developing them said, no, we did this. We got 10,000 comments. They published 24 out of 10,000. They didn't mention that they received a statement signed by more than 500 early childhood professionals, including teachers and pediatricians and researchers and child development specialists, psychologists, opposing the standards. That statement said that the signers, all 500 of them, had grave concerns about the core standards for young children. The standards conflict with compelling new research in cognitive science, in neuroscience, in child development, and in early childhood education about how young children learn, about what they need to learn, and about how to teach them in kindergarten and the early grades. Among the more than 500 signers were the 3 past presidents of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which is considered the foremost organization in America for how young children should be dealt with. 11 copies of it were hand-delivered to the folks writing the Common Core standards. They were ignored. And when the standards were finally written, Dr. Carla Harwitz, who's from Yale, said many of our most experienced teachers are just going to give up because the standards are going to hurt children, and they will not participate in that. Now, the standards weren't developed in isolation. Remember, we looked at Bush the elder, Clinton, Bush the junior. The next president in the line is President Obama. And when Mr. Obama was elected, he passed the stimulus bill. You remember the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And inside that bill was a one-time $53.6 billion appropriation to the United States Department of Education. It was called the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. Race to the top was just one little piece of that huge fund. In order to get the stabilization money, the states had to agree to certain things. The first thing they had to agree to was to move toward the college, remember there's that word rigorous, and career-ready standards, and to establish a pre-K to college and career data system. In order to get the stabilization money, the states had to prove that they were doing those two things. The states could not even ask for race to the top money until they did this piece. So this piece came first. Now, I was one of the people who used to read grants that the state sent. When the federal government wants you to really do something, they put in a page that looks like this. It's called an assurances page. So that the states can't sort of kind of promise, but not really. If the feds want you to do it, they give you the language. This is what we want you to agree to. And then all that the governor does is sign at the bottom. It's called an assurances page. In this case, the first assurance was that the state would establish a longitudinal data system, and the elements of it were federally mandated. The bill was called the America Competes Act. So not only was the federal government requiring a data system to exist, the federal government was going to mandate what it contained. This was confusing for the states, so the feds held training sessions. This is the documents they used at the training sessions. And what they said was, the data system has to be able to connect early childhood, post-secondary, and labor data. It follows you for your whole life. The data has to connect teachers and students so that we know if Mrs. Blankenschmiel in that third grade classroom is complying or not. We can track her students to make sure that she's doing what we want her to do. So a teacher can't close her classroom door and ignore the nonsense. This is a way to force the teachers into compliance as well. The data has to be accessible to the research community and public stakeholders. Who are public stakeholders? Anybody who says that they should have the data. And all they have to do is fill out a form saying that they have a legitimate interest. And that includes vendors. You ever heard of Microsoft? With computerized data. Is it any wonder Mr. Gates is spending so much money? The data has to be able to cross state lines. The only way that data like this, I don't know if you know anything about programming, the only way that data can cross state lines, especially a database as complicated as this, is if every state uses the same coding for the same information. Because the computer doesn't read the words, the computer reads numbers. So everything has to be coded the same. There's really only one data system, and all the states implement it inside their state, because everything is coded the same in every state. If it's 0739 in one state, it's going to be 0739 in every state. The codes will not change. That's the only way it can cross state lines. And the data has to be used at all levels. What are the elements? There were 12. Look at number 1 and 7. Enrollment information and transcript information. That sounds very innocuous until you think about all the things you tell the school when you enroll your child. They know who lives in your house and your family structure. They may know your religion. You give them your health records. If there's a school lunch program, you might give them your IRS tax returns to verify your income. Every extracurricular activity your child is involved in, if that activity includes measurements of weight and height, that's in the data system too. Every discipline problem that your child ever had, which sounds, well, so what? In my state of Pennsylvania, last year, a 7-year-old boy was eating a Pop-Tart, and he took several bites and said to his teacher, "Don't you think this looks like a mountain?" And she said, "No, I think it looks like a gun." And he was suspended for terrorism, because it was a very dangerous Pop-Tart. Probably strawberry, they're very dangerous. His record doesn't say Pop-Tart. His record says terroristic threats. And that's now in the database. Now it's not laughable. So when you think about that data system, every mistake that a little one makes is recorded forever. Now think back to when you were in school. Do you want everything you did when you were 7? I don't. If your child commits a felony and runs afoul of the justice system, at 18 those records are sealed. But if they do it in the school, they're not. So your children don't have the same rights as felons, because it follows them forever. It was called a P320 system. Remember, these are federal documents that we're looking at. Originally, it started with a little box on the top that said 06, 07. It was a K through 12 system. Then they added, at the beginning of 2009, they added the box where they added post-secondary and early education and teacher data. And then with this fund that we're talking about, they have the big box where they added your labor data, English language learners, your financial records, your health records. It goes to neighboring states. P through 20. P is preschool. K through 12 is what you think. 13, 14, 15, 16 is college. 17, 18, 19, and 20 is adult. Once you have a number, it's there forever, and you can be tracked. The U.S. Department of Labor, and I haven't had a chance to put it in the presentation yet, the U.S. Department of Labor actually has, and if you pick up a paper, I did a blog on it, so you'll be able to track it. It's called the Workforce Data Quality Initiative. New Jersey got 2 grants to do it, and it openly says we track you all the way through at the individual level into the workforce. And New Jersey got you got 2 rounds of funding to implement, and it is not owned by the U.S. Department of Education. It is owned by the United States Department of Labor. New Jersey received $1.3 billion in stabilization money to implement the database. You also then, because you applied for and received stabilization money, you were eligible to apply for Race to the Top funds. This is your Race to the Top grant application. It was dated in the beginning of June of 2010. Some of the signatures are May, because the governor signed it, the chief state school officer signed it, and the president of the State Board of Education in your state signed it, which is why the dates are different, because they passed the paper back and forth and all signed it on a different date. Now, interestingly, you see all the signatures. The latest ones are June the 1st. The Common Core standards were made available in the middle of June of 2010. So your state promised to implement standards that they had not yet seen. In this document, in the middle, it says, to the best of my knowledge, all of the information in the grant is true. just like on your IRS tax returns. But the next line is significant because the signers say they certify that they've read the application, that they are committed to it, and that they will implement it. It doesn't say we'll implement it if we get the money. They had to promise before they received a penny that they would implement what the application said. That's truly unheard of in federal regulations. Usually it's if you get the money, you have to do it. But if you don't get the money, oh well. But these people, in order to even be allowed to be considered for Race to the Top funding, had to promise that they would do it before they knew if they got a penny in a document that's legally binding. Your state said that your data system is called New Jersey Smart, and that in the beginning, it implemented 7 of the elements, and they were going to have all 12 of the ones that we saw done by the end of 2012, that you began student identification numbers in 2007, and by 2010 you had a little over 1.5 million children from preschool through high school in the system. Your state said that you had student level enrollment, demographic, and program participation information. So you've already been pulling that together, and there's a student data handbook that makes that available. So your state told Washington, yep, we had this data collected. Your state said that other information was the state's going to need other information. So they're going to be looking at your assessments, your college board scores, the institution of higher education, and then you're going to integrate data from students served by the Department of Correction, the Juvenile Justice Commission, the Department of Human Services, the New Jersey Department of Children and Families, and workforce data from the New Jersey Department of Labor, as well as colleges. So it's not just education data. Your state told Washington back in 2010, they're going to be integrating all of this. Tennessee probably had the best name. They called it the 360-degree view of the child. It's a complete picture of you and your family that is in the database. So if your family has ever had an issue where you were involved with mental health services or children and youth at some level, that's part of the record and part of the database that is being compiled on the child. Your state said that under Race to the Top, they'll enhance the accountability system, and they will encourage local school districts to ensure that every teacher can access the data system at school and at home. Well, if we want to protect privacy of data, we really don't want people accessing it at home, because that means the system is open. Now, one of the last times I was in New Jersey, a teacher said, well, I can't do that. And the correct response is, yet. Because what your state said, they were going to work to make sure that the local school districts made this not only possible, but happening. Your state also said that they were going to expand the data system so that they could get a more comprehensive picture of the students, and that the data system would include groups of students receiving targeted instruction, how they implemented the action plan, all the assessments, student biography and demographics, and all professional development. So it's, again, a complete picture, and it would be made available to researchers. So if you look at the top, we're going to make sure that our instructional system enables researchers to evaluate all of this information, and it's going to be able to make researchers, so the data mart, which is where researchers go, will contain all of this information. If I know the student biography and demographics, I don't need their name to find them. If I know where you live and when you were born, and that you're in Mrs. Blankenschmeel's 3rd grade class and you play football and you're a B student, I can find you. Privacy here is a thing of the past. The second part of the reform assurances to get the money, your state said that they were going to move to implement the standards. Again, the federal government had training sessions. This training session happened in November of 2009. And what they said was, this is cradle to career education. It's not K through 12 anymore. We've expanded the government's involvement in education and their definition to start cradle all the way to career. So the government's going to be involved all the way along your life. And how do they do that? Well, they said you have to set standards. You have to create assessments, and in this system, even if you don't use PARC, your state has to send their assessments to Washington for approval before they're allowed to be used. So Pennsylvania does not use PARC assessments. Ours are called the Keystones. Before they could be implemented, we had to send them to the US DOE and have them approve them before we were allowed to implement them. So the federal government is now controlling the assessments through the standards through Common Core and controlling the assessments. And they told the people from the beginning, the instruction has to align. What you hear when you debate this is these are just standards. This isn't curriculum. That's poppycock. Standards that don't have curriculum attached are not worth the paper that they're written on. Look at it this way. The standard is you have to make a chocolate cake that tastes just like my chocolate cake and has the same texture as my chocolate cake. See my cake? It's wonderful. 3 layers, sprinkles, it's a really good cake. The assessment is I'm coming to taste your cake. How many recipes can there be? 1. Because if you change anything, it won't taste the same. If I control the standard and I control the assessment, and the assessment is high stakes, I absolutely control what is happening in the classroom. Because if you don't teach what I tell you to teach the way I tell you to teach it, your children will not pass the test. And you will not keep your job as a teacher. And from the very beginning, the feds told them, you have to align your instruction. Now, at the federal level, there's been some pushback. In the session that's just about to end of the U.S. Congress, the House put up a bill called the Student Success Act. And when that happens, whenever they put up a bill, they develop a cheat sheet that says this is what's in the bill, so nobody has to read all the thousands of pages in the bill. This cheat sheet talked about how the Common Core has been promoted by a carrot and a stick. The carrot was the race to the top money. You had to promise you would do Common Core to even be allowed to apply for the money. The stick was no child left behind. Remember, 100% proficiency by the end of 2014 school year. If you didn't, the feds could come in and take a series of steps that culminated in them closing the school. Okay, that's a lot of control. The states didn't want that. But the only way that they could get away from it was to ask for a waiver. And Mr. Duncan, the U.S. Secretary of Education, said, yeah, we'll give the states a waiver, but it'll have strings attached. They're going to have to comply with federal priorities. This has never been state-led. The feds have been in control from the beginning, and they're very open about it. Your state, like most of the others, we saw the race to the top application. That was the carrot. Here is your application for a waiver, and it's an ESEA flexibility. Because remember, No Child Left Behind is the reauthorization of that original 1960 bill called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is why you're asking for ESEA flexibility. You're trying to get away from everything's a continuation of that original law. You applied for ESEA flexibility in November of 2011, originally. And in your application, you had 2 options. Option A said the state was going to adopt the Common Core state standards. If you did that, you were good to go. You included your memorandum of understanding. Option B said, well, you don't have to adopt the Common Core state standards. You can write your own standards. But if you write your own standards, your colleges have to come together and certify that all the children will meet the standards, and when they do, not one of them will need remediation at the college level. So you can get a waiver from 100% proficiency by promising that you will have 100% proficiency, or you can adopt the Common Core state standards, which had no such requirement attached. Is it any wonder that the states adopted the Common Core state standards? Over 45 of them did. This is New Jersey's. In your application, you said that you were going to adopt a model curriculum. You were going to align it with the Common Core state standards, and you were going to use what's called the Universal Design for Learning. The Universal Design for Learning, UDL is the letters, is a special ed technique. If I took 100 people, 85 of you on average are what are called visual learners. You like to learn with your eyes. How do I know? I'm going to give you a phone number, and the first thing you're going to do is look for a pencil to write it down. I start to give you directions, and I'm reading from a paper. And what do? You reach for the paper. I want to see it. Visual learning is the most efficient, Our minds are hardwired to learn that way the most efficiently, and most of us, in fact, are visual learners. Of the 15 or so people remaining, about half of them are auditory learners. Auditory learners usually can learn visually pretty well, but they'd rather hear it first. I have one daughter. She's an auditory learner. She's also a classical ballerina. So she listens to music all day long. Her living requires her to be able to translate music into action. No wonder she's an auditory learner. Of the remaining folks, they don't learn very well visually, and they don't learn very well auditorially, which makes it very difficult for them to learn. Those are the folks that we would call special needs. Those are kids that you teach them often with a sandbox, letters, or you have them write them in the air because you use gross motor. If you're teaching something they have to do, you give them lots of extra activities. There's you're trying to guard against frustration, so you interrupt a lot. We're going to read a story. The characters will be, here's some of the words you're going to see. Here's questions I want you to think about. You stop after a sentence and say, now what did that say? Let's see if we can paraphrase that. Now, what was that sentence about? It's called scaffolding. If you think like a window washer, you build a scaffold on the building so the window washer can climb the building. Well, you scaffold education for these kids so they can climb the lesson. Thank God UDL exists, because it does enable us to reach kids that we couldn't reach any other way. But saying that every classroom and every curriculum is going to use UDL techniques is the same as saying that I have 10 folks. This one is the top runner on the cross-country team. This one uses crutches to walk. We're all going to use crutches to walk. Why would you put the top runner on the cross-country team on crutches? If you look, this was developed with the directors of special ed. When you look at these classrooms, and when you talk to folks, they say, but look at all the activity, and look at how busy they are, and look at all the things that they're doing. Because it's UDL. There's all this scaffolding happening. But then everybody moves at the speed of the slowest. And sadly, slowest can't keep up. I did a debate, and one of the teachers talked all about how he scaffolded, and wasn't this wonderful? And I turned around and said, so when do you stop? I said, what? So, well, do you plan to be surgically attached to all these children for their entire lives so you can continually scaffold everything that they see? Well, no. So at what point in your classroom do you remove the scaffold? I'll tell you the point, when they take the state assessment, and then the kids fall apart. Every child falls apart. Because since every child has had nothing but a scaffold, and then they walk into the state assessment where there isn't one, no wonder we have test anxiety. And the kids at the bottom are drowning. This is actually a UDL chart where there's multiple ways for representation, different ways to teach, multiple ways for the kids to interact, multiple ways for them to test. But the standards themselves are flawed. When the math standards are being written, Mr. William McCallum, he was one of the 29 folks on the work groups. He actually attended a national conference of math educators and showed them a draft. They hated them. They said, these are terrible. They're poorly written, they're too hard for the little ones, they're very bureaucratic, why are we in such a hurry? And what he said was, well, the timetable is being controlled by the U.S. Department of Education because they're using this the competition for Race to the Top money to get states to adopt them sight unseen. But he said, don't worry, because the standards won't be too high, especially when you compare them with other nations. Trevor Packer, who is the Senior Vice President of the College Board. Remember we talked about David Coleman, the architect of the Common Core Standards who never taught. He's now the President of the College Board, and Trevor Packer works for him. And Trevor Packer attended the National Association of School Administrators, and he said, well, calculus isn't part of Common Core because Common Core slows math down. So the kids will never get to calculus in this process. The National Center for Education and the Economy, which is a federal think tank, headed by Mark Tucker, who is advising the U.S. Department of Education on how to implement the Common Core standards, put out a document in May of 2013 called What Does It Mean to Be College and Work Ready? And they said it means to be ready to be in a community college. They further define that by saying you need Algebra 1 by the end of your sophomore year in high school. Because since most community colleges start with Algebra 1, there's really no need to teach everybody Algebra 2 for them to go to college and take Algebra 1. It would be a waste, the document said. It went on to say, we know these are very low, but we have to start here. New Jersey, you're a governing state in PARC. Here's your from the PARC website. You are one of the governing states in PARC, which means you'll be doing the PARC assessments. And PARC says that the assessments will be based on the Common Core standards, and they actually have a curriculum content framework, which is available online, that teachers can look at to say, well, if you want to pass the PARC test, here's what you teach, and here's when you teach it. By 4th grade, they need to know how to add and subtract in the standard algorithm. That means you write the problem down and solve it. Before Common Core, that was 2nd grade. But Common Core math is 4th grade. By 6th grade, they need to know how to do long division. Before Common Core, that was 4th grade. However, starting in 6th grade, the kids can take use a calculator when they take the math test, which means they don't ever really need to be able to do this at all. This is from your State Department of Education talking about the graduation requirements of the classes of 2016, 17, and 18. And your kids will have to be college and career ready. The PARC test will be now the graduation requirement for your state. So if the kids pass a PARC test, they can graduate. What does that mean? If you look at math, they have to pass either Algebra 1 or geometry, or Algebra 2. Then I have to pass one of them. That doesn't say and. It says or. So if your children pass Algebra 1, they have met the graduation requirement for these rigorous college and career-ready standards, which is exactly the same as the other states. I attended a training session in Pennsylvania, and they listed the graduation requirements, and it said Algebra 1, and a bunch of us teachers went, that's a misprint, right? Nope. New Jersey's the same. And your PARC tests, the PARC scores, the test will be taken, and the cut scores, what does it mean to be proficient, will be determined after the children take the test. So we'll have all the kids take the test, we'll look at the raw scores, and say, well, if we put proficient here, this many will pass. If we put proficient here, this many will pass. That's not measuring the students against the standard, that's measuring the standard against the student and skewing the data to make it look like however many kids you want to have pass will pass. And you're not the only state doing it. They're all doing it the same way. You get the raw scores first, and then you set passing second. Is that a good idea? You know, the U.S. Department of Education actually does do studies. In 1999, they published a document called Answers in the Toolbox that looked at what does it mean, what do you need to succeed in college? And what they found was, if a kid gets past Algebra 2 in high school, they more than double their odds of achieving a bachelor's degree in college. That study was part of what was called a meta-analysis done by Auburn University. A meta-analysis is where a researcher, instead of doing research, they look at all of the research that other people have done, put it all together to see if they can find trends, like does your research match this person and this person and this person. Usually a meta is 10 years. This was a 25-year meta, so it's huge. And what they found was that secondary math was the biggest single indicator, biggest single thing that you could change to make kids succeed in college. That is, secondary math rose, college achievement rose as well. And kids who got to calculus in high school were 28 times. I did not say 28%. I said 28 times. That's 2,800%. More likely, not just to get to college, but to be a high achiever, regardless of their race, their socioeconomic background, or the kind of high school they went to, or the major that they take. So the biggest single thing we can do for our kids to help them be successful in post-secondary life is push secondary math. Now, does that mean every kid should take calculus? Of course not. Does that mean every kid should go to college? Of course not. But it does mean that when we're setting educational policy, we should be setting policies designed to give every child every possible opportunity to get as far ahead in math as that child can, so that every door is open to them when they decide what they want to do with their life. And Common Core goes in exactly the opposite direction and closes those doors. Isn't it interesting that the Department of Education in 2014 does not know what it did know in 1999? It's not just math. This is English language arts. I actually attended a training session and was handed this document. It's how to teach text dependency. This is called, we're going to have close reading of the text. That's the way that they describe ELA. And you're not supposed to talk about anything outside the text. So the example we were handed was the Gettysburg Address, and the teacher is not supposed to talk about anything other than the words of the address. So you're not supposed to talk about why the North and the South were fighting. You're not supposed to ask the children if they've ever been to a funeral. You're not supposed to ask them if equality is something worth fighting for. You're only supposed to talk about what Lincoln said that day, which is kind of ironic, because Lincoln said, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." This turns that on its head. It's not just the philosophy. This is a 12th grade literature book. It's mine, I bought it. So you're looking at, and you can come up and look at the original if you like. It's a Common Core edition. It's by Pearson Publishing House, and I chose Pearson because they're the biggest publishers of Common Core material in the nation. They are also the contractor for the PARCC tests. So if you want to look at what's happening in Common Core, you should look at Pearson. Now, they're actually a UK company. They're headquartered in the United Kingdom. So this is their American subsidiary, Prentice Hall. They bought out Prentice Hall. They bought out a bunch of things. Prentice Hall is one of the things that they've bought out. This is a 12th grade book, and on the very first page of the student book, the very first thing that they tell the children is that every single selection in the book is available in audio format. And there's also an audio cliff notes. So the first thing that we tell 17-year-old children is you don't have to read a word in this book, you can listen to them, but if you're too busy to actually listen to Shakespeare, we'll give you an audio cliff notes. I had a teacher say, "Well, the teachers won't teach this." And I said, "Did you ever teach 17-year-olds? If you tell them that, didn't we all read Cliff Notes?" Yes, we all read Cliff Notes. But our teachers, I know I've been one of them, did assignments that meant you couldn't complete them unless you I actually didn't want you to read Shakespeare, what he wrote. So I had assignments that you had to actually read the words on the page. But if you wanted to start with the Cliff Notes, that's fine. But the publisher says, you don't have to read this book. You could just listen to it. And when you read through the book, what you find is it is filled with errors. Antonyms are defined as words that are different in meaning, not opposite. And the example is admonish and calm, which are not antonyms. They talk about a frame story. The frame story, like the Canterbury Tales is a frame story, it's a story within a story. So the frame is the pilgrims going on the journey, and then the pictures are all the little stories that the pilgrims tell. And the example that they give the 12th graders for a frame story is the Christmas special Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which is not a frame story. It's flashback. The snowman didn't have a story. So there's no frame. So they're not even technically correct. And then you look at the content. So in one of the selections they're talking about medieval England, and one of the themes is how women are not treated like men, and so it's the whole feminist ideology. And what they talk about in medieval England is how women were not taught to read, which is true. Neither were the men. There weren't any books. This was pre-printing press. There was nothing to read. Even the nobles didn't read. They hired a scribe. In fact, if a knight knew how to read, he was considered a sissy. It was like a mark against his manhood that he could read. So, did you ever see the movie True Lies? You know, lying with true words? That's called lying with true words. It is true that the women weren't taught to read. It is equally true that the men weren't either. But they left that part out. the assumption is the men were taught and the women weren't. That's not true. Nobody was. In one, they're told to write like a sermon, write something that would be a story about a moral to tell about. And the morality is the economy. And in the student's book, the example is, although a van may be convenient for a large family, it is still morally irresponsible. So if you have a large family, you are morally irresponsible. That's not the purpose of the schools. But the children won't know that they're getting a point of view because it's just threaded through a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. So the book is technically incorrect and definitely promotes a philosophy that parents wouldn't see and children wouldn't know to defend against. Does it matter? Well, no, because the Park website says that when the children take the ELA assessments, they can use a spell checker. So they don't have to be able to spell. And the assessments themselves will use adaptive technologies, they're computerized assessments, so they will change to meet your performance while you're taking the test. That means you may not take the same test that the person sitting beside you took. Because if it was too hard, I can make the questions easier so that you can get a proficient. But nobody would know that. The parent wouldn't know that. Nobody would know that the test is changing as the child is taking the test. That by definition makes the test invalid. There's no way to know what any child actually is accomplishing because I can manipulate the test as it's being administered. In New Jersey, your teachers will be evaluated based on a test. There are two factions. The one part is, I know the chart is small, the one side is what happens in the classroom. The other side is how they do on the state assessments. And it sounds like, okay, that's a balance. Except if the children don't pass the assessments, the teacher can't get a satisfactory rating. So the teacher looking at what's happening in the classroom only matters if you've already had all your children pass the assessment. So that's 100% of the assessment, which means the assessment will drive curriculum. Everything will move to the test. In your state, you're moving toward Park, and if you look at how the evaluation, there are 5 levels. The first level is distinguished command, and the second level is a solid command, and the third level is a moderate command. And then there's a partial command and a minimal command. What's the difference between distinguished and solid? But teachers' jobs will depend on that. When they give the definitions, and it's kind of small, so I took the highlighted part and made it bigger. The student response demonstrates full comprehension to get 4 points. The student's response demonstrates comprehension. 2, the student's response demonstrates basic comprehension. 1 is proficient and 1 is not. Who decides what the difference is in those situations? I used to be, I judge forensics competitions. They're always looking for volunteers who know how to do that. That's like debate, and the kids give up and give speeches and read and everything. So I was a judge. I was kind of a tough judge. I was one of those people who actually wanted them to do well. You could score them 1 to 7. So if you've ever listened to junior high children make speeches, they tend to make speeches like this. They come up and then they start to talk about what they would say. And then they begin the next sentence, but then they forget their first sentence. And then they go into the third sentence, but then they forget their sentence. So you lose the second half of everything, because that's what 13-year-olds do when they make speeches. So when I was the evaluator, I graded down for that. And then wrote them, here's things you can think of to improve it, here's activities that will help you, here's ways to think about how you give a speech to make that better. Some children, when they're doing assessments, they stand like this. Have you ever seen, it's like they're rocking a baby while they're giving it, they're looking up here. So I graded down for that too and told them how they could improve it. In one of the events, the person sitting beside me, there were 2 evaluators in every one, and I looked over and she gave every single child a 7. And I said, you realize it's competition, right? We're supposed to be actually grading them. She said, well, I want them to feel good. Okay, how do you know that the person evaluating your child's paper was me or was Miss Lucy Goosey over there? You have no way of knowing that. And since it's full, regular, basic. What's the difference? But a teacher's job depends upon, and your child's promotion or graduation depends upon, this absolutely unreliable scoring mechanism. Because there's no way to know who evaluated. There's no way to know if it's the beginning of the day or the end of the day. You don't score the same at the beginning as you do at the end. So the whole system is broken. In your state, you have what's called the Education Law Center, and they're talking about the phase-in. And what they said was that the states say, oh no, 70% of our districts have the technology, and this is absolutely wonderful, and everybody is for this, and this is terrific. So the Education Law Center went out and started surveying the states, and they said, no, we don't. And the state appropriated $10 per student to implement the PARCC tests. Why did they do that? Because here in New Jersey, you have a law that says there cannot be an unfunded mandate in education. So they funded $10 a child. So now it is a funded mandate. That's not how much it will cost. And the districts are wondering, where are they going to get this? What the state did was played with the data. The test itself, this is right from the PARCC website, just to administer the test is $29.50 a head. And the state's giving you 10. So you're down $19.50 a head just to give the test. Not to prepare for it, not to do remediation, not to re-administer. You're in the hole before you even began. It's not just the districts. This is the GED test, which has been changed to be Common Core compliant. In the GED test, the kids get a source text and then a writing prompt, and they're graded on how well they use the information in the source text to defend their answer. The source text on global warming says that global temperatures are increasing because of human industrial activity and population growth. Global warming is the source of one of the, pardon the pun, most heated debates in American politics today. People are on all sides of it. Whether or not it exists, who's responsible, can we do something about it? They're only given one point of view, and then they're asked in 10 minutes to explain how human activity has directly contributed to the rise in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. What if they don't agree with that premise? They better know all the data out of their heads. So if you agree with the premise, it's an open book test. If you don't agree with the premise, it's a closed book test that you didn't know to study for. They're not grading English. They're grading political points of view on a test that's used to determine if you graduate from high school or not, whether you get into college, what kind of a scholarship you get. Yet nobody knows that they're sorting political points of view, not English. The source text, this is from the social studies part, and it talks about American aid to poor countries and how the amount of aid that we gave to Afghanistan contributed to the poor Afghans who hijacked planes and carried out attacks on the United States on 9/11. They weren't Afghans. They were Saudis, and they weren't poor. They don't even give them accurate information. But the child in the testing situation does not evaluate the data that they're given because they're busy thinking about how to answer the question. So they just embrace it. The test prompt was, should rich countries keep giving aid to poor countries or should they stop? So they give false data and then ask the children to draw a conclusion based on data that isn't true. Here in New Jersey, your department, you're one of the states, I'll have to tell you, your governor is hot to trot on Common Core. They're even telling homeschool families that they have to implement Common Core. It is now the source of a lawsuit where the homeschool community is saying, are you kidding? No. They'll win because federal law is on the side of the parents, kind of without any exceptions, all the federal court cases. But it's still a problem. Somebody has to pay for the lawsuit. Mr. Coleman, the non-teacher who was the architect of Common Core and moved to the College Board, has changed the SAT to bring it into alignment with the Common Core standards. So what did they do? They removed the essay, got rid of the vocabulary section. They've gotten rid of the penalty for incorrect answers so you can guess. And what they said was, well, we don't need all those obscure words. You just need college and career words, just the words you need to do your job. All those obscure words from literature, which we're not teaching anymore, aren't necessary. And since we're not teaching higher math, we're just removing it from the SAT. Why? So that all your kids will still get a good score. So what they did was they didn't measure the student against the test. They measured the test against the kids and removed things that the kids couldn't do, so that the scores won't drop, so people will think everything is fine. Now, if our children actually still read literature, all of this would sound fairly familiar. The book was called 1984. In 1984, Winston rebels against Big Brother, is eventually caught, and winds up in jail, and his interrogator's name was O'Brien. And Mr. O'Brien says, don't you see, Winston, that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we'll make thought crime literally impossible, because there'll be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by exactly one word, with its meaning rigidly defined and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050 at the latest, not a single human being alive today will even understand this conversation? I always like to end with good news. This is my granddaughter. Yes, she's adorable. Why am I showing her to you? Because all of you have a face just like that in your life, that when you look at it, it makes your heart sing. In Pennsylvania, in front of the House Education Committee, the Common Core proponents came and testified, and they talked about why we needed the same standards for all the schools, and they actually called the children widgets. And what they said was, it's like McDonald's. If you buy a hamburger in a McDonald's in one city, and then you go to another city, it's the same hamburger. So why shouldn't all of our schools produce the same quality product? When did our children move from the client of education to the product of education? And if they're the product, who's the client? Does anybody think what we do to the ground beef at McDonald's to turn it into a hamburger is done for the benefit of the ground beef? No. You do something to a product, for a client. Common Core isn't something we're doing for our children. It's something we're doing to them. People ask me all the time, well, you're going to win. Well, the short answer is yes. It's funny, I travel the country, and it's women who are standing up everywhere. And once I got asked why, and I said, well, it's kind of funny. Men, God love you, fathers will die for their children, and that's true. Mothers will kill. And when the U.S. Department of Education decided to declare war on every child in America, they forgot that all of those children have moms and grandmoms attached. And there isn't one of us who was ever going to say, oh, it's okay, you can have my little one, over my dead body. So why did I come here? So that you would know what's really happening behind the talking points. Because for me to protect that face, I have to get all of you to protect all of your faces. That works for me. I was an advisor to the Reagan administration. He had a commission on the family, and I was privileged enough to be one of the folks who worked there. And this President Reagan used to say, freedom isn't guaranteed. We're only ever one generation away from tyranny. Freedom doesn't get passed through the bloodline. We have to teach it. We have to defend it. We have to tell it to our children. Or one day we might be the generation that is telling our children and our grandchildren about an America where men and women used to be free. I have no intention of becoming that generation. And I know you don't either. So I came here tonight to ask you to join me. Stand up. Get involved. People say, but I don't know what to do. The worst thing you can do is nothing. The best thing you can do is tell a friend. Make sure you walk out with a paper. Walk out with at least one video. Because you can put it in your computer and bring friends in. And sit down and say, we're going to watch it together. You don't have to memorize everything I memorized. You can share the information easily. Put a Stop Common Core bumper sticker on your car. Put a Stop Common Core sign in your yard. If your children are in the public schools, take them out tomorrow. because they're battlegrounds and we don't fight battles with children in America. Talk to every elected official. Make sure they know it's an election issue. 2016 is not that far away. There are that's a presidential year. Federal elections will be at the forefront. It is time to tell the U.S. Department of Education to get their bureaucratic fingers off of our children and return control of our classrooms to parents and teachers, which is where that control belongs. And you tell them that in election cycles. Don't be shy. It almost doesn't matter which of those things you do, as long as you do one of them. This is a battle we can win. How long it takes depends on every single one of you. Thank you very much.